corners of the earth and the far corridors of history. Dateline, World War II. June 1942, the Central Pacific. A lone Catalina reconnaissance plane flies through scattered cloud cover in search of the massive Japanese naval task force en route to Midway Island. Vastly outnumbered, it is essential that the American fleet find and attack the Japanese before Vice Admiral Tuichi Nagumo knows they are there. After hours of flying, the pilot spots the fleet some 700 miles west of Midway and reports its position. Immediately, Army Air Corps B-17 scramble from Midway to strike the approaching fleet. Dropping their bombs from 20,000 feet, the B-17s do not score any hits, but they do prompt Nagumo to move his attack schedule up by 1 day. On the morning of 4 June, from a position 240 miles northwest of Midway, Nagumo launches approximately half of his attack aircraft, armed with high explosive bombs, against the atoll. It retains the other half of his planes armed with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes to deal with any American ships that may be in the area. At the same time, Nagumo orders 7 search planes to reconnoiter a 300-mile radius around his carriers. With visions of repeating their glorious victory at Pearl Harbor, the Japanese attackers approach Midway. This time, however, they are spotted, and the defensive forces on Midway are alerted. The Americans launch their bombers and fighters before the Japanese have a chance to destroy them on the ground. The bombers begin to search for Nagumo's carriers, and the fighters look to intercept the incoming Japanese planes. The Japanese quickly realize this is no Pearl Harbor. They have to fight their way to their target. The American aircraft manage to down several of the attackers before they reach the island. Over their target, they are greeted by fierce anti-aircraft fire. Although the attack does extensive damage, it comes far from achieving its intended goal of rendering Midway useless as an airbase. Meanwhile, the American bombers launched from Midway locate Nagumo's carriers. Once again, their bombing runs are ineffective, but they do keep the Japanese off balance. As the attack continues, Nagumo learns from the squadrons returning from Midway that a second strike will be necessary. He orders his remaining planes to be refitted with high explosive bombs more suitable to land attack. While the planes are being refitted with their new payload, Nagumo receives a disturbing report. One of the search planes has spotted an American surface fleet barely 200 miles north. Nagumo orders his remaining planes again to be refitted with anti-ship ordnance. Meanwhile, Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher's task force, centered around the carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, has finally closed to within striking distance of Nagumo. At 150 miles, he is at the outer limits of his aircraft's range. Fletcher and his second-in-command, Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, decide that hitting the Japanese first is critical and launch their attack. The planes head for Nagumo's last reported position, desperately hoping to catch the Imperial Navy completely unawares. In the meantime, the returning Japanese strike force has reached its carriers. Nagumo decides to retrieve the returning planes before launching a strike against the American task force. With this decision, he seals the fate of his carriers. At 9:40 a.m., Devastator torpedo bombers from the Hornet are the first to spot the Japanese flat tops. Before they can attack the ships, 50 Japanese Zeros flying combat air patrol attack them. Within minutes, all 15 of the Devastators are shot down. "14 torpedo bombers from the Enterprise and 12 from the Yorktown are next to take up the attack. Again, the Zeros pounce. All but 6 of the bombers are quickly splashed into the sea, and no Japanese ships have yet been hit. Nagumo, ready to launch his strike on the Americans, has his flight decks covered with fully armed aircraft. As they are about to take off, 33 Dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise appear overhead. The Zeros, who have been busy eliminating the torpedo bombers, are at too low an altitude to intercept the dive bombers, and they get a free shot at the massive Japanese flat tops. Within minutes, 3 of the Japanese carriers, the Kaga, Akagi, and Soryu, are reduced to infernos of exploding bombs, aircraft, and fuel. As the jubilant pilots turn for home, the surviving Japanese carrier, the Hiryu, launches 46 torpedo and dive bombers and a dozen escort fighters to strike back at the American carriers. Following returning American planes back to the Yorktown, the Japanese attack. The Yorktown is still suffering damage from the Battle of Coral Sea. The Japanese hit her with 3 bombs and 2 torpedoes. Despite a heroic effort, the Yorktown's crew cannot save her and are forced to abandon ship. Late in the afternoon of the 4th, the Americans find the Hiryu and deal her a critical blow. The next day, damaged beyond repair, she is sunk by Japanese destroyers. For the Americans, it is an astounding victory. Midway is still in American hands, and the Japanese have been dealt a decisive blow. 4 of their best carriers now rest on the bottom of the Pacific, along with hundreds of their highly trained air crews. These are losses that will take Japanese industry and training programs years to replace. And although the Americans have lost the Yorktown, the balance of power in the Pacific has been drastically changed. The Imperial Navy is now irretrievably on the defensive. Japanese hopes for further expansion in the Pacific have been lost forever. June 1942, Washington. President Franklin Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, having arrived in the capital after a brief but pleasant visit to the President's estate in Hyde Park, New York, begin informal discussions regarding the nature of Allied operations for the remainder of 1942 and 1943. Unlike the Arcadia Conference earlier in the year, these talks are at the same time less formal and more acrimonious. At that meeting, Churchill and his staff had been quite successful in persuading the President and American military leaders to accept their views on what the initial Allied approach to the war ought to be. But since the conference, the Washington contingent have begun to show signs of independent thought and action that the British, particularly Churchill, find disturbing. Not long after Arcadia, the American Joint Chiefs of Staff began to feel as though they had been railroaded by an English delegation who, having been at war for some time, were better prepared to state their case. The conferees had agreed to focus the bulk of Allied military might on defeating the Germans before dealing with the Japanese in the Pacific. However, continuing advances by the Emperor's armed forces have made it clear that to ignore the Japanese would be a mistake. As a result, there has been an increase in the flow of U.S. men and materiel to the Pacific theater rather than England. In addition, Roosevelt has begun to make decisions independent of his British counterpart. Following the signing of the Anglo-Soviet Treaty last month, Soviet Foreign Secretary Vyacheslav Molotov visited the President and described to him the tremendous number of casualties and profound misery being suffered by Russian soldiers and citizens as a result of their efforts to beat back the Nazis. Sympathetic to their plight, Roosevelt, without consulting Churchill, pledged to alleviate the pressure by mounting a cross-channel invasion and opening a second European front before the end of 1942. While there is no way he can in good conscience object to America's escalating defense of the Pacific, Churchill is determined to persuade FDR to delay the opening of a second front on the continent. Churchill argues that the proposed landing of between 6 and 8 divisions at an as-yet undetermined location on the coast of France in less than 6 months' time will be a bloodbath. Rather than France, he contends, the United States should execute an assault on the coast of North Africa, coming to the aid of British forces battling there. The Americans are not happy with the Prime Minister's position. The President is reluctant to renege on his commitment to Stalin. The Joint Chiefs are quick to point out that While Churchill, it seems, is unwilling to spill British blood in an operation to aid the Russians, he shows no compunction when asking Americans to lay down their lives in support of the English army. Churchill is, however, able to convince Roosevelt that Rommel's recent advances in North Africa are a threat to oil shipments coming through the Suez Canal, and in response, the president agrees to divert shipments of tanks and other supplies to the beleaguered British there. As the meeting concludes, Churchill feels satisfied despite the tempest. He knows that even though he was unable to convince the Americans to abandon their plan for a European invasion in 1942, he has certainly thrown a wrench into the gears. In addition, he has managed to redirect some shipments of supplies to his armies in Africa. There is another result of this meeting which is pleasing to Churchill. Early on in the visit, while he and FDR were at Hyde Park, they had discussed an ongoing U.S.-British project intended to develop a bomb using uranium, a weapon which would harness the power of the atom. The two agree that all of the project workings will be moved to American soil, but that any results will be shared by both countries. The result is that the Americans will do all of the work, bear all of the cost of the development process, and in the end, share the results with Great Britain. For the crafty statesman, it is a most pleasing arrangement. 11 June 1942, North Africa. On the stinging sands of the desert, the British and Nazi armies are squaring off for what may be the final battle to determine the continent's future. General Erwin Rommel, the German tank genius, believes that that battle will come at the Egyptian city of El Alamein, that it will come soon, and that his army, perhaps the best trained in the world, will win. That thought terrifies English Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who knows well that if the English toehold in North Africa is lost, it will be almost impossible to regain. The German Africa Corps fights its way into the town of Bir Hakeim. The battle is fierce but short. The Germans take little time celebrating their victory before looking forward to their next target, Tobruk, the last significant obstacle between Rommel and El Alamein. Hard by the Mediterranean, Tobruk is an English stronghold no longer so strong. The Gazala line, a defensive buffer to the town's west, has been stripped of much of its firepower. Infantry and armament have been moved back to reinforce the defenses around El Alamein. The English are instead counting on tanks to blunt the German offensive. The British have more than 900 tanks on the outskirts of Tobruk and have shipped in as well 35,000 infantry reinforcements. Tanks are, of course, Rommel's specialty, and upon arriving at Bir Hakeim, the Desert Fox sets up a replay of what has been his strategy all across Africa. He places huge artillery batteries at strategic locations, and then maneuvers his tanks to draw the English into range. As they have before, the English blunder into the German trap and find themselves cut literally to pieces by the German 88mm guns. Of the 900 tanks British General Sir Claude Auchinleck takes into battle on the 11th, only 65 come out on the 13th. Not surprisingly, Auchinleck believes that Tobruk cannot be held and suggests a withdrawal before the Germans can regather their strength. Churchill rejects the proposal, insisting that Tobruk be held. The Prime Minister orders Auchinleck to do so. At dawn on 20 June, Rommel launches what he believes will be the final assault on the city. More than 150 aircraft pummel the town center and the harbor from above, while German and Italian artillery around the city's edges lob thousands of rounds at the English positions. An infantry assault clears a path through an enormous minefield, and by noon, German tanks are freely wandering the streets of the city. What English commanders had hoped would be an orderly evacuation of Tobruk degenerates into chaos. The English headquarters moves from place to place, only steps ahead of the advancing Germans. The convoys setting out for El Alamein become shooting galleries for German tanks, which fire point-blank into trucks loaded with infantry. By sunset, the battle for Tobruk is nearly over. General Klopper, the South African general in charge of British forces in the city, gets word out to his headquarters in El Alamein. "If you are counterattacking," his message says, "please let me know." There will be, however, no counterattack. The English forces dug in around El Alamein will stay dug in, awaiting Rommel's next inevitable advance. At 9 o'clock on the morning of 21 June, Klopper runs up the white flag of surrender. As the remaining English troops fall into German hands, it is clear that they have won the respect of their enemies. Rommel, a professional soldier through and through, tells his captives, "You have fought like lions and have been led by donkeys." Rommel's victory is so decisive that the day after the battle's end, Adolf Hitler promotes him, giving him the highest rank in the German army, Field Marshal. By that time, Rommel is already looking east to El Alamein, and what he is confident will be the ultimate German victory in Africa. To those who know him, it seems appropriate that New Year's Eve, 1941, marks the date of Admiral Chester Nimitz's assumption of the command of the Pacific Fleet in Pearl Harbor. The new year is customarily viewed as a time for personal change, but Nimitz's appointment may lead to a period of extraordinary change for the Navy. Despite his 56 years, he is a youthful, vigorous man with a passion for new ideas and bold concepts for the future direction of naval warfare in the Pacific theater. As interested as Nimitz is in guiding the Navy according to his new vision, his opinions are rooted in a reverence for naval history and on his own decades of military experience. Born and raised in Texas, Nimitz had never seen an ocean when he set out for his first year at the Naval Academy. As he would in all new experiences, he excelled, graduating 7th out of a class of 114. Following graduation, he was among an elite group of young sailors who were chosen to join the Navy's new experimental submarine force. By embracing the submarine, he began to distinguish himself as a man with a keen mind for recognizing the possibilities of new technologies and for developing tactics which best exploit their strengths. By the end of the First World War, Nimitz was a commander and one of the foremost submariners in the Navy, but he realized that in order to continue advancing his career, he would have to transfer to the regular service fleet. His experience as captain of several ships over the following years was particularly timely, as he was afforded the opportunity to witness the early development and growing pains of the aircraft carrier. Despite his distinguished career and boundless energy, it nonetheless came as a surprise when on 13 December 1941, Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox told Nimitz that he was to take command of the Pacific Fleet. Nimitz was told that one of the reasons for his promotion was the Navy's desire to send someone to Pearl who could ease the fear and shame of the survivors of the attack. Upon his arrival, he gathers the men together and tells them simply that they were not to blame for what happened, that he has complete faith in their abilities, and that he wants very much for all of them to remain under his command. Morale improves immediately. Seeing the aftermath of the attack firsthand, Nimitz states that in his estimation, the Japanese blow has not been so devastating after all. Pearl Harbor remains a viable naval facility. The machine shop, the submarine base, and millions of barrels of oil were untouched in the attack. As a result, the Navy does not have to retreat to California. Realizing that lack of information is the principal reason for the success of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, he insists that he receive all intelligence information raw as it comes in, knowing every second that passes is one in which he could already be countering Japan's plans. As Nimitz sees it, the most effective way to renew the strength of the fleet is through use of the aircraft carrier. While he regrets the tragedy of December 7th, he is nonetheless relieved that the ships sunk were battleships, not carriers. The attack, for Nimitz, points plainly ahead towards a day when the battleship, long the center of naval warfare, gives way to the newer, smaller, quicker, and ultimately more powerful carrier. And while many in the Navy argue that our reliance on the battleship has brought us peace in the past, Nimitz maintains his faith that it is the carrier that will bring us peace in the future.